Hello there. Quite a lot has changed since I last sat in this chair talking to you, just a couple of weeks ago, in fact. Now, in that interim time, the world has changed. This is now going to be our home for the next few months, and we're going to be focusing totally on making online content. All our workshops have been cancelled. In all, 7 tours and workshops stretching from January all the way through to June have been cancelled. At not insignificant financial impact, but the key thing that Kristin and I want to share right now is our empathy and care and thoughts for everyone around the world who's being affected by this situation, in terms of health, in terms of mortality, and obviously the financial consequences and the economic situation that's going to unfold, not just during this, but in the considerable aftermath. So, a couple of things before we start this week's video. First of all, it was recorded in Harris about a week to 10 days ago, before the travel ban was put into place. So we were out there, we had one workshop for a week that we were able to complete, and then obviously everything got shut down and we had to more or less try and repatriate our clients to Australia and America, and obviously things got really out of hand and we had to try and get home as best we could. Now we're here. As I said, I'm going to be focusing on building this online content, including the Vision and Light series with Adam Gibbs, and I have also lined up 2 other guest speakers who will be coming on over the next few weeks also. I spoke with Mark Adamus the other day, another really good friend of mine from way back, and one for tomorrow, which is my dear friend Sean Bagshaw. So we've got a really good lineup of potential people that I'm going to be talking to in a very similar fashion regarding creativity, the state of contemporary landscape photography, and of course vision and light and our own unique vision. Before we start this video, if you could consider clicking on the link below and purchasing my ebook, Luminosity and Contrast. It's over 200 pages of what I consider quite insightful and refreshing approach to creative landscape photography. It gets great reviews and great feedback, and now with a very weak pound, it's never been cheaper to buy it. So you'd be helping us out massively by purchasing a copy of that ebook. Other than that, the stuff that follows is me spending time out in the landscape, engaging with it as I always do. The weather was incredibly wild with so powerful winds, so hopefully you'll find this little trip to the Outer Hebrides healing for the soul, and we can move forward with some optimism and some hope. As usual, please subscribe, thumbs up, share it with everyone who you can think of. We're going to be spending a lot of time sitting watching our computer screens over the coming months, so hopefully this channel will be on high of the list. So let's take a trip to the Hebrides. So we've spent a couple of hours down here at the beach this morning, and what we've had is an evolution of a morning where it started bright and clear, and then cloud has come in, it's got more overcast, the light's got more subdued, the colour that was early on faded. Now, what's been happening when you come to a beach with 4 or 5 different people, each person is bringing a version of themselves into the landscape. Now, what seems to be the situation is that the landscape can either be delivering incredible light in beautiful conditions, or it can be atrocious. And the main determining factor of the output, the photography output, is who are we bringing to the equation. If we're bringing someone that's morose and downhearted and has no enthusiasm, no real interest in the landscape, no interest in being here, then it's very unlikely that interesting photographs are going to be made, regardless of the conditions. However, if we bring a good version of ourselves into the landscape, even when the landscape deteriorates in its conditions, beautiful photographs are still being made. Now, the group of people who've been here this morning have all brought good positive energy to the place, and the conditions have been less important to the creative photographic output. Now, I think this is the most important aspect of landscape photography, is it's not the landscape that we need to worry about. It's not the conditions every day. It's not the weather. It's not the height of the tide. It's not the cloud cover or the quality of the light. It's who we bring into the landscape. It's what version of ourselves do we bring into the equation. So what I'm going to challenge you with now is take your best versions into the landscape with you and don't worry about the conditions. It's our expectation of conditions that instantly puts the needle in the balloon of our enthusiasm. So if we come into the landscape with none of that and just an inquisitive, curious, almost childlike joy of just being in the landscape, then good images are likely, although not essential, because we can still have a beautiful time appreciating the landscape. So I'll leave you with that now as we're packing up and heading off to the next location, where the light looks pretty poor, but I'm sure we will enter into that landscape with enthusiasm and joy. In somewhere as dramatic as the Outer Hebrides, the key element with seascape photography is understanding the impacts of time and movement, and secondly, simplifying and isolating key components within the landscape. Now, in a superficially busy scene, we have to try and understand what are the key elements, and it's the interaction of the water with those key elements that is going to be where we're going to find our photographs. Now, I don't tend to look for compositions. I've always been the type of photographer who lets the landscape tell me what is interesting. And in this particular case, it was the way the water was just completely swamping the foreground rocks. It was the highest tide I'd ever seen here. The wind was coming in at nearly 100 kilometers an hour, and the surge of the water over these rocks was fascinating. And it was these two little boulders down in the bottom right-hand side that just caught my imagination. Everything else is really just context, but it was those two rocks and the way that they were just holding on almost against the ferocity of the elements that kind of captured my imagination. And really, every photograph needs something that can just root it, something that's just there to be seen and enjoyed. Now, there's not a lot of traditional compositional thoughts in this particular shot. A lot of the weight is over to one side. The left side is very open and ethereal. And to my imagination, it gives a sense of expansiveness out there to the left, to where the Atlantic Ocean is coming roaring in. The colour palette is naturally harmonious. These images need very little processing, just because the colour palette is in the Outer Hebrides is just so gorgeous. So yeah, it's nice to be able to look at it, and I certainly like it. Now, this second scene, this is a really good example of where I allow myself to just let the landscape tell me. I mentioned that over the first photograph. Down at the bottom of the screen there, you can see a little red pool. And that little red pool became the focus for my entire photograph. So I decided it was safe. The waves seemed to be receding enough that I was able to get down here and not feel that I was going to get hit by a massive wave. And I spent some time just looking at it, understanding the colour. And if you look at that red pool, how it contrasts with the blue sort of turquoisey water, I found that transition, and this is a word I use an awful lot of the time, a transition from the warmth to the coolness of the water. I was able to make a composition using my 12mm lens. This is a Laowa 12mm, fabulous, fabulous wide-angled lens, manual. So you'll notice on the back of the camera it says f4. I was probably shooting at f11, but now you can see I'm moving the aperture down and stopping the lens down to probably f16 there. And that's how you change the exposure. Now, when we see the final photograph, those transitions of warm to cool become much more apparent. The raw file itself is typically quite flat, as you can see here, but there's two things that are important. One is that raw files are just potential images, and you can see with a bit of processing we've been able to bring out the warmth in that foreground, allow the transition from warm to cool. And that transition is engaging. The second key component with this particular photograph is the time. Now, I chose a shutter speed, I believe, of 4 seconds, and during the 4 seconds the water was able to rush up onto the surface of these beautiful smooth rocks and then sweep down again back out towards the ocean. The timing of pressing the shutter is incredibly important. You need to hit the shutter when the water is at its peak and then allow it to rush out. And you can see how that water rushing out is impacting with a wave that's coming in out in the middle distance there. And that creates a kind of energy point as well. Had I done a long exposure like I did in the first image, we would have far less texture and far less detail. I've never been out there in such ferocious weather. Now, these rocks can get incredibly slippy. It's just dangerous down there. So you'll see, I'm showing my age here, but I'm walking out with a certain trepidation because I know just how slippy those rocks can be. This is a boulder that's just kind of, it's a slab of rock really that's just perched up on the other rocks. And it's caught my eye on a number of occasions, and the tide or the weather conditions had never quite been right for me to go out there and spend some time with it. Now I'm getting low because that's how you control the perspective of this composition. Now my exuberance here is somewhat unusual because I wasn't doing an exposure of only a couple of seconds, which would have caught those beautiful streaks of water coming off the boulder. So I'm getting all excited, but at the end of the day, the end product doesn't really show any of that energy. And I think that's an interesting point, is that the experience we have in the landscape is the dynamic one. Everything is moving all the time. But for this photograph, it's about calmness and statics. And actually none of that energy is really represented in the photograph. But I'm allowing the graphical nature of the rock itself to be the energy. The rock starts down there on the bottom left and sweeps up to the right-hand side there. That diagonal is mirrored by the angle of the mountains in the distance, and therefore creates a symmetry and a harmony. Now, this type of image may not be to everybody's taste, but from my point of view, landscape photography is absolutely about our relationship with the landscape, being out there in the field and feeling the elements. And I can absolutely assure you that the wind and the waves and the noise and the energy of these systems was absolutely phenomenal. This area of the coast of Harris is one of my favourites. Something I've mentioned already here is we get drawn to light. Light is a massive trigger for the human visual system, and you can see there's two main sources here. There's the sun, of course, setting behind that cloud, and then the way the light is reflecting on the surface of those foreground rocks. This creates a palette of opportunity, and it's this little boulder again on the right hand side, the way it's capturing the warmth of the setting sun, and it's pardon me, it's isolated in a field of blue, a blue energy, a blue atmosphere. And once you can get something warm nestled in amongst a sea of something else, cool atmospheric water, then again we have a transition. Now, isolating something in the middle of ethereal beauty is a really good way of making photographs that are going to be kind of mysterious and engaging. I really like this one. I think it's probably one of my favourite photographs I've made out on Harris in recent times anyway. I haven't been shooting a lot of sunsets over the last year or so. It's something that I kind of lost interest in, but this one in particular has really captured my imagination. The clouds, the atmosphere, the depth, and the processing has been done to exaggerate some of those things. So we can see that we have a lot more detail and texture in the foreground, and that recedes out to the horizon. And we know that's a long way away because it's much, much less black than the stuff in the foreground. Understanding depth is massive. Understanding atmosphere is huge. Now this is up in Lewis, a very famous location, well, one of the most famous locations on the west of Scotland, I guess. And I don't think I've ever seen it as wild as this. The wind was blowing this foam around all over the place, and the waves were crashing up to 50 or 60 feet up into the air when the big sets were coming through. Yeah, it's such an incredible spot. And as you can see from that wave there, that's a long way above the ocean. Again, this is another example of me shooting a sunset, which isn't something I normally do. When we walked out, it was really grey and overcast, and just as the sun was setting, things came alive. Now again, shutter speed here has proven to be the most important thing. When everything's dynamic, finding the shutter speed that gives you the aesthetic that you're looking for is absolutely critical. Even this raw file, I think, is very atmospheric, but I was able to open up some of the shadow detail and balance out things a little bit better in processing. The shutter speed has allowed the water to still retain a feeling of motion without it getting too abstract and too misty. I love the way we're getting some height in these waves, and the colour is really coming through. I've been to this location many, many times, and this is one of my favourite photographs that I've taken there, because it's a good combination of the transitions that we've been talking about. We have cool to warm, we have dark to light, we have atmospheric, water and cloud. Now you'll see the detail in the cloud here is critically important. If you do a longer exposure, all of that texture and detail in the cloud disappears, and once you've lost it, it's gone. So if it's, don't just think, oh well, I'm by the ocean, I'm going to do a 30-second exposure for everything. The wind was coming in, it was ferocious weather, and I think I've chosen a shutter speed that best harmonises the sky and the ocean. Now for the final photograph, we were back out on the west coast of Lewis. Now, some would look at these weather conditions and think, well, this isn't particularly useful for making photographs in, but I like high contrast light. It doesn't have to be the warmest of light as long as it has contrast. And in a location like this, when you have dynamic shape in the landscape, it's a case of finding elements within the landscape that are looking their best given the light as it comes. We can never rely on what the light is going to be doing. We can drive for an hour or 2 hours, and when we get there, it's very different from how we imagine it might be. And there's a huge danger, and I've talked about expectation in some of my other videos. I never go to the coast with expectation. I like to sit and look at it and let the things that are talking to me talk. The more I go in with my opinions and my expectation, the less likely I am to listen to the opinion of the landscape. And I think as a landscape photographer, then I should be listening to the landscape. And in this particular image, it's all about contrast and luminosity. The point of that pinnacle contrasts beautifully against the background rock. Now, this is the colour version, and I think the colour photograph is beautiful, but for some reason I decided to just go black and white. I think both of them work, and I think that's a very interesting point, that if you take the colour away and the composition still works, then you know it's not just the colour that you're resonating with. So hopefully you'll find the images that we've been looking at not only a good representation of the place, but different styles and interpretations of a landscape. So I think we'll leave you with this. So thank you very much for watching this video. As usual, if you found it useful and helpful to you, please subscribe, click the thumbs up, the bell notification, email it to all your friends, stick it on social media, share it with everybody, and let's try and build this channel as best we can. I'll be seeing you during the week when I'll be interviewing Sean Bagshaw in the Vision and Light series, and then after that it'll be Adam Gibbs and myself, followed by Mark Adamus. So stay tuned, and there'll be more video content coming your way very shortly. Stay safe, keep away from lots of other people, be mindful, don't overshop. Please, let's all try and get through this together. Until later in the week, be safe everyone, all the best.
You look in your element.